Welcome to Festool TV. My name is Frank, and today I'd like to show you different applications with different ways to sand. Usually I work with belt sanding machines for solid woods or veneered wood. Mechanics and carpenters usually work with large wide belt sanding machines, long belt sanding machines. And the belt sander also moves exactly like this, that is linear. And I can work with solid wood in a linear direction, in the direction of the grain.
Auf der anderen Seite das furnierte Material, das furnierte Plattenmaterial.
I use the frames of the band for the veneered flat material in such a way that the belt sander is guided and does not tilt. And this very thin material is levelly and clearly sanded. Belt sanders are ideal for working with if I'm not at the workshop and don't have a large stationary machine. Profiled woods, such as this square timber, with one or multiple rabbets, must of course be worked on accordingly. The surface is usually not the problem. Rather, it is often these rabbets which must be sanded down here. The straight blade stroke curves from milling must be leveled. What is the best way to do this? Of course, manually with the sanding block is one way, but for this, we're providing a machine. It's called the LS130. I can, of course, use the corresponding sandpaper for the LS130. Here, I would like to first show you how this machine works for the sanding motion. For this, I use a light sandpaper, which I would normally use for varnishing, the Brilliant 2 sandpaper. Now I mark the individual sanding grains on my sanding plate. Switch everything on. And now you can see the sanding motion. So here I'm simply sanding up and down. This means that I will not hurt the rabbet on the edge because I'm only moving in a linear direction. Depending on the right sandpaper, that is Reuben 2 with the right grain mix,
in der dementsprechenden Körnung.
We recommend the 8 paper for this. With it, I can sand down this rabbet. If I would now like to sand both edges, both sides of the rabbet equally, I even have the option of changing it all very conveniently. And using a sanding pad here in the shape of a triangle, and thus the whole rabbet is covered. The sandpaper is here simply placed on the stick fix system so that I can sand out the rabbet here. Of course, everything is clamped in place so that it is stable, but I have the option of working with this machine in different profiles very quickly and effectively, with handrails as well, in a linear direction. The question is, in which areas do we put the random orbit sander? This is a gear-operated sander, and here too, we can see how the sanding motion works. For this, we also make markings on it, or we mark the sanding grain and switch it on. Now we'll take a look at the motions. Here we're taking about a 5 millimeter sanding stroke. This means that the sanding plate moves in a stroke of 5 millimeters. With this sanding stroke and the corresponding sandpaper or sanding grain, I can sand it down a great amount. Thus, this sander is best used for flat sanding, for repeated sanding on doors, for example, or also in drywall construction if I'm working on plasterboard surfaces. Even finer than a sander, I can work with a random orbit plate sander. It's also interesting to see how the sanding motion occurs. For this, I use the sandpaper, turn the engine speed down, and now again mark the individual sanding grains. For pressing down on it, I'm holding the plate firmly so that you can see how it's different from the sander. You can also see the same sanding motion as with the sander. But now we're coming to something very important, the concealed sand. This means that the individual sand grains are blurred by the motion of the plate, from which I will have a fine sanding result. You can already see how the individual sanding grain moves over the surface, and the whole surface is worked on beautifully. Random orbit plate sanders also come in 3 millimeter strokes. I use these if I have prepared sanding work for gloss finished surfaces, for surfaces which are very fine and must be finely produced.
Exzenter-Tellerschleifer gibt es auch in 3 mm Hüben. Sprich, wenn ich jetzt hier vorbereitende Schleifarbeiten habe zum Hochglanzlackieren oder für Flächen, die eben sehr edel und fein gestaltet werden müssen.
Both variations, that is, random orbit plate sanders and sanders with gear units, combine the Rotax. We are also talking about rotating random orbit plate sanders here. The Rotax has two sanding motions. First, a sanding motion which is controlled by a gear unit in a certain curvature. This means the plate moves in a defined operational path. The other I can turn on here, and then I'm making a random orbit plate sanding motion. I can also show you how it all works with the sanding motion. With a gear unit. Now you can see the motion of the individual sanding grain very clearly. An accurate curvature path brings about a level sanding motion on my surface, but very aggressively. Thus, I can fantastically sand down the necessary unevenness, such as putty areas or blade stroke bumps. In the next step, I will change very quickly to the random orbit plate motion by changing the machines. Thus, I keep the same sanding as with my random orbit plate sander device. So you have the option then of either using a combination device for your work, a special one for the pure random orbit plate sander, or a sander with which I can sand the surface here, as well as in drywall construction areas with plasterboard surfaces. All of these machines are fantastic to work with in carpentry, and I think this is what you should use for your daily work. I hope you had fun watching the different sanding motions with these machines. I look forward to next time. Until then, Frank.